Hey guys, what's going on? Andrew coming at you, and in this one, I thought it'd be interesting to talk about 12 differences between the Swedish school system versus the United States school system. Coming from someone that grew up in the United States system as a student, I went to university there, and then if you include my student teaching, I was in the school system working for about a year. And if you look at the Swedish system, I've been a teacher in Sweden for 6 years. So that's where my knowledge comes from, and that's where my view coming from. I don't think that one system is perfect or the best. I like a lot of things about the Swedish system. I like a lot of things about the U.S. system. Ultimately, I think that the best schools in the United States can compete with the best schools in Sweden. So let's get into it. One of the first fundamental differences that is just interesting in general is that in a Swedish school system, kids are going to call you by your first name. So I would be accustomed to usually students calling us by our last name, which in the US is like a sign of respect, but it's just something you hear all the time. Like you always hear your last name when someone addresses you in a mail or a phone call. And in the Swedish school system, they call me Andrew, which is just interesting in general. It wasn't necessarily like a negative thing that I noticed. It was just something that I found interesting. The next thing I want to go into, though, is that teachers do not have the same power structure that they probably have in the United States. I feel like the teachers I had growing up had such a higher authority over students, where in the Swedish school system, it's more of a level playing field. A teacher has authority, but if you're a student in a Swedish system, you feel a lot more on the same level. And that just comes down to the Swedish structure of power in general. Like bosses in the United States have a lot more power over than they do in Sweden. And that's just how Sweden kind of views power structure. It's just not the same. A boss here has to really agree, and a lot of people have to agree together. So I don't think it's a particular different thing just with schools in Sweden. I just think it's a fundamental philosophy that's different. Number three, there's a different discipline structure in Swedish school systems versus the United States school system. U.S. schools are a lot more strict. It's a lot more easy to give a kid detention. I remember getting a detention in elementary school because I didn't do homework 3 times, to give you an example. That can happen. It's very easy to pull a kid out of school and have in-school suspensions. And in the Swedish system, it's really, you're not allowed to just give someone a detention or punish someone if it's not like educational. You have to make an argument that it's educational. So there's a lot of laws and stuff that happen with that. It's a lot more difficult legally to pull a kid outside of school and have these harsh disciplines. And I think in the U.S. system, like I think sometimes in Swedish schools, it could be good to have a little bit more authority to do more. But if you're making the counter argument to the U.S. system, we have a lot more harsher discipline. But if you also look at our prison numbers and things like that, we have one of the highest in the world. So I think you can make an argument as well that maybe high discipline doesn't necessarily lead to better behavior. Another interesting thing I noticed about Swedish schools is it seems that every Swedish school kind of has a short day. So there's a day where the kids go early so that the teachers can have a meeting, which I find to be interesting. Number 5 is going to be everybody gets a free lunch. And this is one that's interesting, and I like it about the Swedish school. And of course, I know nothing is free. You got to pay taxes. I see that all the time in the comments. But what I like about it is, let's say a kid in Sweden doesn't have the best home life. We know at least 5 days a week during the school year that kid is getting one solid meal every day. It's a very, very healthy meal. The food is a lot healthier here in Sweden than you have in the States. There's much more structure with that. And I do believe that having a healthy diet leads to just living a healthier life. And although there's not the case now, but when I was in the Swedish school system, I mean American school system, and I was a student, it's changed, but I could get Coca-Cola, Mountain Dew every day, candy, I could eat French fries every day, pizza, and even in like my college life. And the thing is, when you're young like that, you're not old enough really to make the best decisions for yourself. You know, and 16-year-old me liked pizza and French fries and didn't necessarily think of the consequences. So I do think it's nicer that we have, healthier food here. Number 6 is going to be the grading structure in Sweden, and I prefer the American grading structure over the Swedish grading structure. But like the American grading structure is pretty much A, B, C, D, F, and it usually runs with percentages. So if you get 90% and above, that's going to be an A. 80% and above, this was in university, that's going to be a B. And usually a teacher will calculate everything. Maybe it's 60% tests, 30% quizzes, and like 10% projects, and maybe there's a percentage that's attendance, and they add that overall average up and say, this is your grade. I find in the Swedish system, there's E, C, and A. There's also other letters in the grading system, but what makes this one a little bit more different is there's usually a bunch of different standards you have to meet. I think it's open to a lot more interpretation because you can also, you only have to show the knowledge sometimes one time to display that you have it. And in the Swedish system, you can sometimes take tests over again and things like that. And I just find that the American system's a little bit more concrete personally. I just feel like it's like exact. This is what you got. This is why you got that. But that's my interpretation. Okay, fine. You can take tests and things again. And I'm not trying to be critical in a negative way, but like I have a fundamental time where in my life in college, I only had 2 tests in a class, and I got a F on the first test, and it was all because I just didn't go to class, and I thought I knew everything about history, and then I went to class, and I got an A, so the average came out to a C, and I kind of preferred that because the life lesson I learned from you only get one shot, because in life you only get one shot with the interview and things like that, but at the same time, I don't think it's necessarily like a terrible thing. It's just a difference. I still think that the system makes sense. I just think it's a little bit harder to understand than other systems. Number 7, and this is a difference between American schools, is that there's mentorship in Sweden, where a particular teacher or maybe a group of teachers has a responsibility for students, and you meet with the parents sometimes twice a year to have what's called like utvecklingssamtal. It's when you have a conversation with the student about their grades, where they're going, their goals, and you discuss like where's the students going, what's the school going to do to help the student, what's the student going to do, what's the teacher going to do or the mentor do. And we don't have that in the American system. A lot of times in the U.S., everybody fends for themselves, and kind of in the U.S. system, you're just considered to be responsible for yourself right away, and there's not a teacher that's involved. But when I was in university, believe it or not, I did have a mentor. So I think it's interesting here. It's very nice and interesting to be a mentor in the Swedish school system. And an interesting thing about that is in the Swedish school systems, you have a class that you're with all the time, your mentor class, and you can be with that same class for multiple years. A lot of people that are friends in Sweden were friends from such a young age, and I think that's a really cool thing that they have that experience. But in the American system, you change classes a lot more, so I see positive and negatives with both. I think, wow, the tightness you have from having one particular class has to be awesome, but let's say you don't like, I don't know, someone from that class, you're with them for a lot of time, so like one thing that was cool with the American system was that you did switch around so much, but at the same time I still had close friendships. So I don't think one's like better than the other. This is just how my mind thinks about these type of things. The next one's going to be that year 9 in Sweden is like a big deal compared to the United States. In year 9 in the US, you're starting your first year of high school, which is kind of like gymnasium in Sweden, which is kind of like their high school. Year 9, to get into the gymnasium, you have to get so many points on your grades. In the U.S., in 9th grade, it's your first year of high school. It's not the biggest deal in the world. You're just kind of getting started, where there's a lot more pressure on students in year 9 to kind of get their grades in order to get into the school they want, and they're already dealing with competition. And I think that's great and all, but I remember how I was in 9th grade, and I don't think it needs to be so stressful. I think that kids nowadays are a lot more stressed about getting into the right gymnasium and about life, and I just think at 15 or 16, I just think that's a bit too much. Number 9 is national tests. Now, I don't like the national test system in the United States, to say the least, because I just think it's a lot of pressure. We're always being tested. And in the U.S. system, it kind of punishes schools. A lot of times they would say to a school, if you're struggling and your kids don't do well, you're going to get less money. And an interesting point with this is that in the U.S. system, there's like a standardization. Like you have a state test, which is like your region, like you would have in Sweden, but you also have a national test. And the tests go out directly to independent testing group that grades the tests. I'm not saying this would ever happen in Sweden, but I always found it a little bit interesting that teachers grade their own tests here in school. I just think it maybe could be better to have a centralized place where you do it, so you have a neutral party grading it. But luckily, like national tests aren't as big of a deal as they are in the U.S., and I don't think it affects schools' money as much. So I don't have a necessarily problem with it. I just think it's interesting and different. Number 10 is every student gets 11's which is like called student choice, where they can pick an activity that they want to go ahead and do. And they have to have so many hours of this over the course of their education. I think that's an interesting thing, but in the U.S. school, we don't really have that. But what you have is an integration with sports, which I actually prefer because I think it's better. Because in the U.S. system, you have like basketball, football, and a lot of these sports are linked to the school. A lot of the coaches happen to go to the school. A lot of the students go to the sporting events. And what I really enjoy about it is to play on a football team or any of these things, you have to maintain good grades and you have to have good discipline in school. And I just think there's a nice benefit there of having the coaches support with the school systems to get kids on the right track. It's something you dangle out. You say, hey, if you want to, you got to do good in math. If you want to play football, you need to get by. So it's an interesting thing. Although I can say a negative to the U.S. system with that is if you look at the university level, there's a lot of maybe football players that are excellent football players that aren't really good students, that the school system kind of turns a blind eye to and doesn't really help them learn. And if you think about it, a very, very small percentage of college players actually go to the NFL or go professional. So they would probably benefit from more having like more stuff that you have to do education-wise. Another one that I find to be very, very interesting is that in the Swedish school system, everybody gets a break. Like we got like a 30-minute recess when I was in the U.S. school system up until about 5th grade. And then maybe sometimes I would have like a study hall period. That was a time where you just could sit down and maybe do things like that, like you would study or do other things. But in the Swedish school system, as far as I've seen, every student usually gets like at least a 20-minute or a 30-minute break every day to kind of go outside and get some fresh air. And I actually think that's a good thing that they have in the Swedish system that maybe we could benefit from in the States. But as far as I know, in the state system, it's always just school, 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 school. So that's one interesting thing that I thought about. Number 12 is going to be the free voucher system, which I think is interesting. So in Sweden, a student can choose like any school they want to go to. If they don't like a school, they can get out of that school and try to get into lottery to get into another school. I don't want to say it's a lottery, but you get on a list and you have to wait. And I think that gives the student a lot of power to choose what school they go to. And that's interesting. Like in the U.S. system, and this is, I think, important to point out, the worst schools in Sweden are nowhere near as bad as the worst schools in the U.S. When I was in Ohio, student teaching there, I particularly was at a school where they didn't have like the right computers, they didn't have enough books that the kids could take home, and I'm not even kidding, like people outside the school while I was going to the school were smoking crack outside. This was a school in Youngstown, Ohio, a rough area, and you can't tell me that the kids there have the same benefit and the same way of success as someone that's just down the street in Ohio that has a rich school. So your school system in the United States is based around how well the taxes you can generate from the schools are. And in the Swedish system, every student is worth a certain amount of money. So if you keep kids there, that's how much money you get per kid for the school. I think that's an interesting thing. I think there's a lot of positives with that. I think there's a lot of incentives with that. So I think it's positive. I will say one negative I think is possible. I'm not saying this happens, but it's a possibility, is I do think that certain kids can bounce around from schools a lot, and possibly that could be a negative thing because maybe they have an underlying diagnosis, like maybe they have a learning disability in math, and it never gets identified because they bounce and bounce and bounce, or it's possible that they can get some knowledge gaps. So I think overall it's not abused. I think it works, but I think a small percentage of students can constantly bounce around until they get certain issues taken care of. So that's interesting. And I think the last thing to say with that, as far as the differences in education, because it's important to point out, is that education in Sweden is free. Now, it's not, I hate people always write on my comments, oh, you have to pay the taxes for it. I get that, and that's true. And you have to borrow some money from the government in Sweden if you go to university, usually, if you want to pay for living expenses and stuff. But the difference between the U.S. model and here is like, it takes forever to pay it off. It's nowhere near the same amount. I would say the average you owe in taxes in the U.S. for going to school is probably $50,000 and in the Swedish system, it's probably closer to like $10,000 to $12,000. A lot of things are included, and in the U.S. system, you have to pay for school, and in the competitiveness and everything else, the prices have kind of gone up in general to go to university. And yes, you are in debt. Yes, it's not free. Yes, we have a higher tax rate in Sweden than we have in the United States. I get all of that, but you're not in debt as soon as you come out of school. And I think that's the biggest difference really, is when I see people my age, like, you know, my girlfriend and stuff like that, she doesn't live with the same level of stress that I have to pay my tuition bills, because all my tuition bills every month probably average out to be about 5,000 to 6,000 Swedish crowns. So we're talking like $800 to $900 of my salary every month has to go to paying the bills back. And if you think about it, if you want to get out of debt, you got to pay all this stuff off. Plus, you got to try to save a lot of money and stuff. And it's just the added stress that's in my life that I don't think the average Swede has to deal with. And I think that education should be seen as a a right to life and not like a privilege. I think it should be something that's fundamentally guaranteed. I don't know how we bring down the cost of that in the United States, but I think that's what we could do better. I think that we can lift up a lot of the schools that we have that don't do so well. And I've always heard the argument that we spend more than the average other country on kids in school, but that might not lead to being efficient, though. Like, there's probably a way to be a little bit more efficient. So I think the things we can work on the best is having better quality food, working on cutting down the cost for university, and also lowering how long you have to go to school. Like, I went to school to become a teacher, and I was in the school system for like 5 years because I transferred. I had to go to another school. And yeah, it's great. I had to take astronomy and all these other classes, and I got a lot well-rounded. But when you're paying $50,000 back, I would have rather paid $25,000 and had 2 years of school to come out and be a teacher. So those are the differences. I want to stretch again that I don't think like one system is better than the other. I love being a teacher here in Sweden, and although maybe the system isn't as there isn't as much discipline, I'm not like really that strict of a teacher to begin with. Like, I think there's a way you can make things strict in a classroom. You have certain expectations, but what I mean is, like, personally, I don't like to raise my voice or have to get angry to get people to listen. I'd rather have a conversation with them anyways. It just kind of fits my personality. I like to stay calm and relaxed. So it works really, really well for me. And the things that I point out that are criticisms of both systems are just my opinion. But I follow everything by the book the way you're supposed to here in Sweden, just like I would in the States. So if you like this one, guys, don't forget to go ahead and hit that like button, as it really helps me out. It was a lot of fun to do this one. If there's anything that I missed, and I'm sure there was, go ahead and type it in the comments below. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Hej då.